Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get started this Saturday morning. Thank you all for joining us for the Cape Perpetua Speaker Series. We hold this speaker series on Saturday mornings at 10 a.m. We're doing it through March, but right now we have our schedule up through December. This morning we'll be hearing from Joe Liebezeit on Oregon's Black Oystercatchers and Rocky Habitats. And we're taking a break next weekend for the holiday weekend, and then we'll be picking it back up again on Saturday, December 5th, on the topic of lichens and lichen bioindication science. My name is Tara Du Bois, and I am the communications coordinator for the Cape Perpetua Collaborative. And the collaborative's vision is to foster conservation and collaboration within local communities. And our three guiding principles are community engagement, leveraging resources, and engaging in partnerships. And as you can see here at the bottom, we have a variety of partners, which include federal partners, state agency partners, some local nonprofits, as well as the Confederated Tribes of Coos, Lower Umpqua, and Siuslaw Indians. Our focus is around the Cape Perpetua Marine Reserve, which is the largest of 5 marine reserves in Oregon. In addition to its marine protected areas, there are protected waters that stretch from Yachats to Florence. And I always like to give a quick fun fact every weekend, something a little different. And this week's fun fact is that in addition to the 14 square miles of marine reserve, you can see that here in red, and 19 square miles of the North Marine Protected Area plus South Marine Protected Area. There is also 22 square miles of a seabird protected area just to the south of the Marine Reserve. And we host a variety of community science projects, as you can see here. Some of them are seasonal, some of them are monthly. So I encourage you to check out our website at capeperpetuacollaborative.org and click on the events tab, and you will be able to find when things are scheduled and get registered accordingly. And in addition to this speaker series, we also host a Young Scientist webinar series. It's the second Tuesday of every month through April. And so we've also have those posted on our calendar as well. I encourage you to check out those topics. And do feel free to connect with us on our Facebook page and our YouTube channel at Cape Perpetua Collaborative. I will be recording this presentation as well as past presentations, and they're all hosted on our YouTube channel and on our website blog. I will be taking questions for today's presentation, so please feel free to put them in the Q&A section, and at the end of Joe's presentation, I will go ahead and we will address those questions, and Joe will be able to answer those for you. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Joe. Joe Liebezeit, he is the Portland Audubon staff scientist. He's been working with them since 2013, and leads their community science and coastal conservation programs. And prior to his position with Portland Audubon, Joe worked for the Wildlife Conservation Society for 12 years, leveraging on-the-ground science efforts to protect wildlife in Arctic Alaska. He received his bachelor's degree in zoology from the University of New Hampshire and a master's degree in wildlife management from Humboldt State University. His work crosses conservation science, policy, and outreach disciplines. He serves on several scientific and policy advisory committees and has contributed to numerous peer-reviewed publications and conservation planning processes. And it's been a pleasure also. I work very closely with Joe in my position as the collaborative communications coordinator, and it's always a pleasure to work with him as well. And so, Joe, I'm really looking forward and excited to have you here today. And from there, I am going to let you take it over.
All right. Well, thanks, Tara. Does everybody hear me and see me? See the screen?
Yes.
All right. Well, again, thanks, Tara and the collaborative for inviting me to give this talk on oystercatchers. I'm really looking forward to it. You know, oystercatchers are just a species that I think everybody on the coast that lives on the coast in particular can connect with and knows and really enjoys. So here we go. Before I talk about oystercatchers, I'm going to talk a little bit about why I love shorebirds and why I think they're an important indicator species and how they really connect different places in the world. When I worked in the Arctic in the past, part of my job was to monitor bird nests up in these remote places up, not far from Barrow, Alaska, and in really remote areas and sometimes. And one little story I can share with you is one time we were out there, and part of our job was to capture certain shorebird species to take blood samples from them for testing for, at the time, a different pandemic, the H5N1 avian flu, if you can recall that. And we at one point went to a site we hadn't been to before, and it was very remote, and we got out of our bush plane or walking around, and we saw a bar-tailed godwit, which you can see here in this picture, and it had an orange color flag on it, which indicates where the birds were originally captured and banded. And I didn't know the orange flag. I knew that in North America, when a shorebird is captured and banded, color banded, they put a green flag on it. So I knew green represented North America. I didn't know what orange represented, but luckily the shorebird community is very small, and I had a little guide with me in the field that told me orange meant this bird had originally been captured and banded in Australia. So that was very intriguing, because here I was in northern Alaska and seeing this bird that had originally been tagged in Australia. And so when I got back from the field, we connected with our Australian colleagues and found out that this bird had been banded 10 years prior to when we saw it. And knowing that the bar-tailed godwits have this amazing migration, they basically fly from Alaska during the southward migration across the ocean, and they don't really stop until they get to New Zealand and Australia in some cases, which is just amazing. And then on their northward migration, they fly up through the Yellow Sea Basin in Korea and Japan, and then kind of curve their way back to Alaska. So when you total up the mileage for a bird, this particular bird, which is was at least 10 years old when we had captured it, it had flown, approximately 168,000 miles, or 6 times around the world. So that just gives you a reason to be excited and to wonder about these shorebirds and how they connect different habitats and communities across the world. And that's what got me excited about shorebirds and conservation originally. So with that, I'm going to just talk a little bit about Portland Audubon and some of the work we've done on the coast and kind of our historical activities a bit. Portland Audubon was established back in 1902. We were originally called the Oregon Audubon Society, and we're one of the oldest conservation organizations in Oregon. Our founder, William Finley, can be seen in this picture on the lower, or on the right-hand side with his colleague Henry Bowman. And back in the early part of the 1900s, they did expeditions all around Oregon. And in this particular photo, you see them at Three Arch Rock. They also visited Malheur and Klamath, and they had these large cameras, plate glass cameras at the time, and you don't see any ropes. And of course, we wouldn't want to be doing this nowadays as a biologist, climbing up to these common mirrors in this picture here, both danger to the humans and disturbance to the birds. But back then, that's the way they did things. And through their subsequent lobbying to the Teddy Roosevelt administration at the time, they were able to get Three Arch Rock protected, and also other iconic places around Oregon. So Portland Audubon has this legacy of protecting some of the most important places in Oregon. Of course, the Three Arch Rock is now part of the much larger Oregon Shores, or Oregon Coastal National Wildlife Refuge System. Jumping ahead to the 1980s and up into the present, we've been very much engaged in trying to protect the marbled murrelet. Again, for those of you who don't know, the marbled murrelet is a bird species that has a very unique life history. It breeds in old growth and mature forests on the coast and forages in the ocean. And because of logging and other activities, other stressors to them, both at land and sea, their populations have declined. And so we were one of the groups that led the getting them listed federally under the Endangered Species Act back in the late 1980s and early 90s. And most recently, we've been involved in protecting them and trying to get them uplisted at the state level in the Endangered Species Act. And also a lot of our coastal forest work, for example, our work to protect the Elliott State Forest is related to protecting this species. In 2012, we were one of a number of groups that helped establish Oregon's marine reserve system. And Tara mentioned that, that the Cape Perpetua Marine Reserve is right there off the coast. And that's one of the reasons why we have the collaborative, is to highlight that reserve and its importance. And more recently in 2016, we were involved in protecting forage fish species. Forage fish are those small fish like sardines and herring that are important for seabirds, for forage. And we were involved at that time in protecting a number of different forage fish species that aren't commercially, that weren't commercially in plans, in management plans, and now are. So that's just a snapshot of some of the work that we've been involved with on the coast over the years. And I'll talk a bit more about some of our more recent work in addition to, and how the Black Oystercatchers are related to that. So currently, some of our priorities are seabird protection, and it also includes shorebirds like the Black Oystercatcher, marine reserves and protected areas, and of course, Tara talked about that. In this photo, or this map here on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see Oregon's 5 marine reserves and marine protected area complexes. Of course, Cape Perpetua Marine Reserve is right here in the middle on the Central Coast and is the largest marine reserve. There's also Cape Falcon, Cascade Head, Otter Rock, and Redfish Rocks down here. I'm not going to talk a lot about marine reserves. Other than that, they are basically, marine reserves are a place where you can't extract any marine life or fish or have any development activities. And they're set aside for protection of biodiversity and for science. And they're going to be up in 2023 for review by the Oregon legislature. And at Portland Audubon, we're very much supportive of keeping the 5 reserves we have, and potentially at some point in the future, considering other places for additional marine reserves to improve the ecological connectivity of them. The other big initiative we're working on right now is protecting our rocky habitats on the coast. I'm going to talk a bit more about that and how oystercatchers are related to that work. So back in 1994, the state of Oregon developed a rocky habitat management plan for our coastline, and about 40% of Oregon's coastline is rocky habitat. It's that rocky habitat both in the intertidal and subtidal habitats, and also up into the upland rocky areas are of course iconic and beautiful places, but they're also important for marine life. And they're also very popular with visitors to do tide pooling and things like that. Since the plan was originally written back in 1994, a lot has changed, where there's a lot more concern about climate change. There's a lot more visitation to the coast. And so there's a new opportunity now for the public to actually participate in protecting additional sites. That I'll talk a bit more towards the end of the presentation after I talk about the meat of the presentation, which will be on the oystercatchers. But I just want to make you all aware of that. So let's start talking about oystercatchers. First, I'm going to talk about just around the world about oystercatchers. There are 11 different species around the world, and some people that aren't birders or not familiar with oystercatchers think that they are a seabird. They're actually more closely related genetically to shorebirds, so they're in the same group of birds as plovers and sandpipers. They're not in the group of birds that includes things like gulls and albatross and auks and merlets. So that's just one distinction. And again, they are around the world, 11 different species. In the United States, there are 2 species. There's the American oystercatcher, which you can see in the picture in the upper right here. They look similar to our black oystercatcher, except they have that white belly and chest. They are a species of conservation concern in a number of places, including in Oregon, and I'll talk more about that with the black oystercatcher. But there is at least one oystercatcher species, the Canary Island oystercatcher, that has gone extinct. There's an endangered oystercatcher, the Chatham Islands oystercatcher, and there's one that's threatened in Africa as well, the African oystercatcher. The black oystercatcher, what we have here in Oregon, just a little bit about their life history. They range from basically the Aleutian Islands up in Alaska, all the way down to the Baja Peninsula in Mexico. They're a relatively large shorebird. They're much bigger than a Western sandpiper or semi-prominent sandpiper, which are the small sandpipers you see often on beaches in the wintertime. And they're roughly the size of a crow. They tend to nest on gravel and rocky habitats, and they forage almost exclusively on shellfish. And so we consider them to be really tied heavily to the rocky habitats. And that's why, one of the reasons why we're involved in that rocky habitat process that I mentioned previously. So looking a little bit more about what oystercatchers eat. Again, bivalves or clams and those kind of things are important for them. Mussels, which you can see in the photo up here in the upper left, are important. Marine worms, crabs, limpets, snails are all important. They will, in some places, take advantage of large amounts of, like, for example, herring. When herrings spawn in California in certain places, like other birds, the oystercatchers will flock to those areas to exploit those kind of ephemeral food sources. But in general, again, they're really focused on eating those shellfish. In terms of their breeding behavior, they build a nest scrape, and as you can see in the photo up in the upper left corner here, or upper right hand corner, they're not a very elaborate nest, and they're called a scrape, similar to a lot of other shorebirds that don't build a very elaborate nest. They typically lay their eggs in Oregon in early to mid-May through June for their first nesting attempt, and they typically lay 1 to 3 eggs. Their incubation period, which is that period where they're sitting on their eggs, is roughly about a month, 26 to 32 days. Both adults will incubate the eggs. It's not just the females, and that's called biparental nesting. They after they hatch from their eggs, it takes them about 40 days before they can actually fly or fledge. And they can take about 2 years. They take about 2 years to mature. So the immature birds, the juvenile birds, which you might see that look a lot like the adults after they get their adult feathers, often have a dark tip to their beak. That's how you can tell a juvenile or first-year bird from a mature bird. So here's just a sequence of photos. I like to show off photos from some of our volunteers on the coast. A lot of the photos that you're going to see in this presentation are taken in Oregon, including this one here, which is taken on the south coast. Here you can see a couple of adult oystercatchers with 2 chicks. These chicks are, less than a week old. The chicks here are about 26 days old, so about halfway to fledging, or a little bit more to halfway to fledging. You can see the 3 chicks here on the right side. And again, here's a chick. You can start seeing it's getting the orange beak with the black tip, as I mentioned before. And here are recently fledged chicks. These chicks are, around 40 days old, maybe a little bit older. And again, if you were out birding and you weren't looking closely, you might think that these are all adult birds, but when you look closely, you can see these two birds on the right have the black tip to the bill. They also do not yet have the red fleshy eye ring around their eye, nor do they have the yellow iris, which is another thing to look out for when you're monitoring these birds. Again, this picture is taken by one of our volunteers, Diane and Dave Bilderback on the South Coast. In terms of some of the predators that will try to go after oystercatcher nests and eggs and chicks, I have a list here. And the picture up of the peregrine falcon. Peregrine falcons are not so much a nest predator. They're not going to really focus on the eggs or chicks. They're going to actually they'll focus on the chicks and occasionally will go for an adult. But some of the more typical avian nest predators that are going to go after eggs and young birds are the western gull, glaucous-winged gull, common raven, bald eagle. In terms of mammalian predators, the usual suspects: raccoons, striped skunk, American mink, river otter, sea otter, red fox. In Oregon, we do not have sea otters at this time, and this is a picture on the right-hand side of an actual river otter that sometimes we'll take to the ocean, and it's just a unique observation. I'm just throwing it here in the presentation. Another thing that we are concerned about is the growing number of people that come to the ocean, and of course we love to see people enjoying the ocean, but it's difficult sometimes for the birds when people are unaware that birds are nesting and disturbing them, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. So a big part of our efforts on the coast are to have people come and enjoy the coast, but also to educate folks on the best way to enjoy the coast, but while at the same time minimizing impacts to marine life, including the birds. So a bit more on the life history of the oystercatcher. They can be a long-lived species. There's records that indicate they can live at least up to 15 years or more. They generally, unlike when I talked at the start of the presentation about the long-distance migrant shorebirds, black oystercatchers are kind of more of a homebody when it comes to a shorebird. They are in the southern part of their range in Oregon, Washington, and California. They're not known to really migrate. It's thought that they pretty much stick to their breeding areas, and they tend to be territorial and tend to be monogamous. And they'll often use the same territories year after year, and they'll often nest in sometimes in the exact same location, but often within a few meters or 50 meters of where they nested the previous year. In the wintertime, they do move around. They don't do long distance migrations, but they will often form winter flocks of 20 or 30 birds, or sometimes even more. So why study black oystercatchers? Like some of the other oystercatchers around the world I mentioned before, they are a species of conservation concern. The US Shorebird Conservation Plan lists them as a species of concern. And here in Oregon, the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife Nearshore Strategy lists them as a strategy species, which is the same as basically a species of concern. I'll talk a little bit more about why they're a species of concern on the next slide, but as I mentioned before, they're very much tied to the Rocky Habitats in Oregon, and so they're an indicator of intertidal health. If the oystercatcher is not doing well, it's likely that the intertidal zone is not fully functioning well. And there's a lack of information. There is a lack of information on the species for certain parts of its life history, and that's what we wanted to try to reveal in some of the studies that we're doing. So in terms, again, of the conservation concern of the black oystercatcher, they have a relatively narrow range. Again, they're really restricted to that Rocky Habitat zone on the coast. So any disturbance on the Rocky Habitat zone can disturb this bird. Globally, their population is pretty small. The estimate across Alaska down to Baja is somewhere around 10,000 birds total. So if you take that in perspective, a shorebird like the sanderling is thought to globally have a population of around 300,000 which is a lot higher than the black oystercatcher. And then there's the birds like the western sandpiper, which is estimated to have a population of around the world of 3.5 million, or a seabird like the common murre, which we know here in Oregon is our most common seabird that nests on a rocky habitat. They are known around the world to have a population of 18 million. So the black oystercatcher has a relatively small population globally. They're also threatened by human disturbance. I touched on that before. I'll talk more about that as we go along. Climate change is a big potential impact for them as sea level rise occurs over the next decades. It could cover up some of their historic foraging areas. Again, they forage on bivalves, things like mussels. And so if some of those mussel beds become harder to access because of increasing sea level rise, that will, you know, affect the oystercatchers. Another thing is ocean acidification, as folks on the listening today may know what that is. But basically, as we pump more and more carbon dioxide into our atmosphere, some of that gets soaked up by the ocean and lowers the pH of the ocean, increasing its acidity. And that is shown to be preventing some animals that deposit calcium carbonate, like clams and other bivalves, to be inhibiting their growth. And so if those animals are impacted, of course, black oystercatchers are going to be impacted since they rely on them largely for their diet. I mentioned oil spills here. Thankfully, in Oregon, we don't have that much to worry about that. But in Alaska during the 1980s Exxon Valdez spill, there certainly was an impact of black oystercatchers up there, so they can be impacted by oil spill and other kind of spills like that. So in Alaska, the black oystercatcher is known to nest on kind of in rocky habitats, just like here in Oregon, but often more kind of cobbly, beachy type of habitat. And it's thought that the predators up there are less numerous, so they don't have to be in more precarious locations like they do here in Oregon for nesting that are harder to access for some predators. Here's a typical habitat for a black oystercatcher nest in Oregon. You can see that red circle around where a nest is. Again, in Oregon, the habitats they generally are nesting on, you know, more rugged cliff faces and things like that. And they're also in closer proximity to people. So you can see a housing development here very close to where this oystercatcher nest is. I'm going to talk a little bit more about our results, what we've been finding so far in the monitoring that we're doing. But first, I'll just mention that back in 2005 and 2006, the USGS did some of the first intensive coastwide surveys of oystercatchers in Oregon. And USGS is one of our partners on this project. We've continued to collaborate with them. But back then, they did these surveys. I'll talk a little bit about what they found and compare it to what we're finding. So the Oregon Black Oystercatcher project is started back in 2015. Portland Audubon started the project. Again, it was built off that work by the USGS a decade before. But we do have many partners on this project. A key partner is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who every year, except for this year because of COVID, have been able to provide us an intern to help with this project. So that's been a huge help. We also partner with a lot of the coastal groups. Without volunteers on the coast and without promotion and recruitment by some of these groups, we couldn't do this project. So I really need to thank them. That includes Friends of Cape Falcon, Friends of Haystack Rock Awareness Program, the Audubon chapters on the coast, and also the Cape Perpetua Collaborative. The goals of our project are to kind of split into a science goal, which is to estimate the population size, the distribution of oystercatchers on our coast, and look at their nesting success and the disturbance impacts on them, and using all that information to inform best management practices. The second goal is kind of more on the outreach side, is increasing the awareness and engagement of not just oystercatchers, but also of our wider breadth of coastal conservation initiatives, which I kind of highlighted at the beginning of the talk. And Black Oystercatchers, this project is largely driven by volunteers. So we rely on citizen scientists or community scientists to collect a lot of the data that we rely on. And so that's a huge part of it. And the nice thing about Black Oystercatchers is that they're kind of the perfect community science species. If you're not an experienced bird watcher, it doesn't matter because they're easy to identify. You can mistake a bird that looks like this. They're all black with that big orange bill, yellow and pink legs. And in the summertime when we monitor them, they're pretty vocal and obvious on the Rocky habitat. So they're really a great bird for pretty much anyone to be able to start monitoring right away with some training. So we've done both abundance surveys of oystercatchers and nest surveys. And first I'll talk about our abundance surveys. And abundance surveys pretty much is just counting the birds in a specific area on the shoreline. And so when you look at the map here on the right side of the screen, you can see all these little purple dots. Basically, those are areas that we have volunteers go out and monitor the shorebirds. And we've basically tried to cover almost all of the Rocky habitat in Oregon, because that's where the birds are nesting. And we have 75 survey routes that we cover. And so it's a pretty big operation. And we focused on doing these abundance surveys from 2015 to 2019. We're currently not doing them anymore because we had enough data to develop a population estimate for Oregon, which I'll talk about in an upcoming slide. But that's the main point of doing these abundance surveys, is to get an idea of our population estimate in Oregon and also the spatial distribution of these birds. And this image here on the lower left side is just an example of a map that we would give to a volunteer to help record their data. So the volunteer would follow along the shoreline on this map and draw in on the map where they're seeing oystercatchers. And we have another data form that fills out the details of all the important observations that we record. We also do nest monitoring, and we're still doing nest monitoring, even though we are no longer doing the abundance surveys, because we have that data, the data we need for now on that. We still are collecting nest data. And what that is that we go out and first of all, we find nests. And then after the nests are found, we try to monitor them at least once a week. And that over time, we determine if the nests are successful or if they fail. And that's called reproductive success. And that's, of course, very important to know if you want to know what the population trend of the species is going to be over time. You need to know how well they're producing young every year. Our goal is to try to find at least 25 nests and monitor them every year. And we've been pretty successful doing that. This past year in 2020, we used a new system. We call it the Bloy Eyes, which Bloy stands for Black Oystercatcher. It's an online data entry system. So our volunteers go out in the field, they collect the data on paper forms, and then they get home. And at the end of the season, they enter their monitoring information into this platform online, and it's been really helpful for us. It allows us to get much better or much more detailed information on these birds, and in a nice streamlined way. And it's partially this system was developed by National Audubon, who we collaborated with on developing this. The nice thing about the Bloy Eyes database is that when you put it in there, it connects immediately to a geographic information system. So the nest locations can pop up on a map almost immediately. And so here is just a snapshot of some of the 2020 nests that we have. Unfortunately, I haven't had a chance to work up all of our 2020 data since it just came in a couple months ago. But so in this presentation, I'm just going to be talking about our findings up until last year in 2019. So with that, what are we finding? Well, as I mentioned before, our abundance surveys help us develop a population estimate. So over the past, from 2015, 2016, and 2017, we developed population estimate, and we used the fancy statistical model I worked on with a biostatistician to do this. It's called N-mixture model. I'm not going to get into the statistics behind that, but it's a population estimate that a lot of scientists are using nowadays. And the nice thing about it is it factors in a detection probability. And what that is basically when you go out and do a survey, the chances of you seeing every single bird in the area that you're surveying is you're not going to see every bird. The bird might be behind a rock, or it might be out of the area for the time that you're there. So by doing repeated surveys in the same place, we try to do 3 surveys at each route that we assign volunteers. You can develop a detection probability, and you can see our detection probability is about 0.52. That means that we're probably on a given survey seeing about half the birds that actually are in that area. And so that allows us to develop a population estimate that factors in detection probability. And so what you see here in these bold numbers is our population estimate for Oregon for the 3 years. So the bottom line is that we'll probably have a population in Oregon of about 500 to 600 birds. These numbers in the brackets below is kind of our confidence interval around those estimates. So for example, in 2016, our average is about 500 birds, but that average is it's 95% accurate, but between 463 birds and 560 birds. We're 95% confident the estimates between those 2 numbers. So we have a small but seemingly stable population estimate of black oystercatchers based on this 3-year data set. In 2006, when USGS did their estimate, they had an estimate of about 325 birds, which again is a small population. In terms of spatial distribution of oystercatchers, again, here are the 3 years that we have that abundance data from: 2015, 2016, 2017. And the thing to focus in on here is the size of those gray dots. The bigger the gray dot, it means the higher density we have of oystercatchers at those areas. So the bottom line from this slide is basically that on the South Coast, we seem to have the highest densities of birds. And in fact, our estimate indicates that 60% of the population is on the South Coast. We didn't really look closely on the quality of habitat, but it could be related to more rocky habitat that's of higher quality for oystercatchers on the South Coast being available for them as the reason why we're seeing higher densities down there. But certainly that gives an indication on land managers of where we might want to focus our conservation efforts for this species. In terms of our nest monitoring, we have it split into hatching success and fledging success. Again, hatching success is when the birds hatch out of their eggs, and then the next step after that is their success for them getting through being able to be flightless to flighted in their fledging success. Hatching success is pretty high. It's 67% across all the years. And here again, we have 2015 to 2019. The N is the number of nests that we monitored in each year. You can see here, I'm happy to say in 2020, even though I don't have the data, we monitored 80 nests. So it's our biggest year in terms of nest monitoring, which is great considering it was a COVID year and we didn't have as many volunteers being able to help. But in any case, when you look at fledging success, again, that's the next step beyond the birds being able to just get out of their eggs. Then can they get to the stage of flying without getting eaten by a predator? Fledging success is lower. It's about 33%. The average number of fledglings per nest is about 0.5, and according to the demographic models and other parts of the range of the oystercatcher, that seems to be about the level that the birds can maintain a stable population. Another thing I'll mention real quickly with our nest monitoring is we did find that island nests are more successful than mainland nests. And that's probably related to the fact that on islands, birds are more likely to evade at least avian nest predators. In terms of the human disturbance results, we looked at, while our volunteers were out monitoring nests, we asked them to record incidents of people and their dogs being near oystercatcher nests and if they affected the oystercatcher's behavior. And basically what we found is that on the North Coast, we had a higher incidence of people and dogs near oystercatcher nests. And that makes sense because The North Coast has a lot more people coming from Portland and from the Willamette Valley to visit the coast. And on the South Coast, we have the lowest incidence of temporary nest abandonment due to disturbance. So when these birds are disturbed, it doesn't necessarily mean their nests are going to be fail right away. But when you have a bird that's disturbed, it can fly off the nest. And if it does that repeatedly, that can lead to nest failure if they can't incubate their eggs long enough, or if the eggs are exposed and then more readily available for a nest predator. And again, the South Coast has fewer people and is more remote. And again, as we mentioned before, may have better habitat for this bird. So that makes sense as well in terms of human disturbance and lower impacts on the South Coast. So our next steps for monitoring is to keep doing our nest monitoring. And if you want to get involved, let me know. If you're already a monitor, thank you. But we're always looking for more volunteers. And we're working with California on a population viability analysis. California Audubon is also doing monitoring of oyster catchers, and we want to do a more regional level analysis to see how they're doing. And that will also look at modeling of sea level rise. So how is all this science work we're doing affecting conservation and the policy work? So as I mentioned, a lot of this work is really driven by volunteers, and some of our volunteers have really taken it upon themselves to outreach to the public and to minimize the disturbance to oyster catchers. So in some cases, like at Otter Rock, which is the marine reserve just north of Cape Perpetua, we know that there is a lot of interest of visitors visiting that site. It's a beautiful site. There's a lot of intertidal habitat, but there's also a lot of people going in areas that they shouldn't go and disturbing oyster catcher nests. And so we've had volunteers like Karen Driscoll in the past that have gone out there almost daily to gently let the visitors know that, hey, there are nesting oyster catchers here, please stay out of these areas. And that's really helped. The science that I mentioned that we're doing on the abundance estimates, we published that in a journal, a peer-reviewed journal this year actually, and so it's important to get those findings into peer-reviewed journals so that they can be incorporated into conservation planning, and so we're doing that as well. Another key thing we're doing is we're contributing our data to larger efforts. For example, I mentioned the Rocky Habitat Management update. Part of that update is to develop a new inventory of marine life and other factors in our Rocky Habitat, so that the public has an ability to look at what current data we have and use that to inform where we need to have stronger protections for Rocky Habitat. We did contribute our oyster catcher data to that, so that's publicly available, and it's part of what people are using to help define where we need to protect Rocky habitats. I'm going to talk a little bit more as we finish up here about the Rocky Habitat Management Plan, which I mentioned earlier. And basically, it's split into 3 types of designations that the public and agencies can nominate for protection. A marine garden is focused on education. Marine research area is, like its name suggests, focused on research, and a marine conservation area is focused on conservation. The basic on regulations at each of these is that at a marine garden, there's no take of marine invertebrates or of kelp or other marine algae. The same is true for research areas, although there are some exceptions. And then for a marine conservation area, it starts at no take of anything, including fish. But then there's a lot of flexibility there where you can allow take of all kinds of marine life, depending on what you're proposing for that site. So currently there are 8 existing marine gardens, 5 existing marine research areas, and only 1 marine conservation area. Now I'm working with a bunch of different coastal groups across all of Oregon to develop proposals that are actually due at the end of this year. And we're nominating, currently, it might change a little bit, but we're hoping to, by the end of the year, propose 2 new marine gardens, 3 marine research areas, and 5 marine conservation areas. So 10 new sites, hopefully. And then they'll go through an evaluation process this spring. There will be the opportunity after this initial phase. This is the initial phase of the Rocky Habitat process for submitting proposals. Next October, there'll be a whole nother phase starting that will go in perpetuity for potentially adding more habitat designations for Rocky Habitat. So if you're interested in this process at all, you can get involved at any time. We're, like I said, we're getting towards the end of developing proposals for this first phase. But again, next fall, there'll be an opportunity to potentially propose more sites, or if any of the sites that we propose don't get through the evaluation process and are rejected, we can always resubmit them. Some of the proposed Rocky Habitat conservation areas that we're proposing right now is Ecola Point. We want that designated as the marine conservation area. Cape Lookout. Audubon Society of Lincoln City is actually the one leading that effort, trying to potentially designate that as a marine conservation area. And Shoreline Education Awareness is interested in designating Coquille Point as a marine garden down near Bandon. I should mention that the Ecola Point site is being worked on, being led by the North Coast Rocky Habitat Coalition. At Cape Perpetua, there are some existing Rocky Habitat protections. And so it hasn't been a big focal point because at this point, it seems like there's, with the Marine Reserve, in addition to these Rocky Habitat protections, there seems to be adequate protection there. So there are two marine gardens, the Yachats Marine Garden and Cape Perpetua. There's also a research reserve, the Neptune State Park Research Reserve in the Cape Perpetua area that currently exist. So I'll just end by just saying, if you're interested in getting more involved with Audubon and any of these on the Oystercatcher project or any of our other community science projects, or on our ocean conservation work, the Rocky Habitat work, or marine reserves, please reach out to us. Again, we're a partner with the Cape Perpetua Collaborative, so you can be a member of or you can be a contributor to both and get involved with both entities. And I want to thank, every year I've been lucky enough to get some funding to hire coordinators to help me coordinate our community science projects on the coast. Amelia O'Connor has helped in previous years, and last year we had Francis Buchanan help. Without their helping coordinate the volunteers on the coast and collect the data, this work couldn't be done. So I really want to thank them. And then, really importantly, the volunteers. Every year for the Black Oystercatcher project alone, we've had as many as 80 volunteers helping. In 2020, we were challenged with COVID. We still were able to mobilize about 40 or 50 volunteers and get a lot of nest monitoring done, which was great. With that, I'll end my presentation and open it up for questions.
Thank you so much, Joe, for that. That was great. I always love and appreciate seeing the Black Oystercatchers, and I know of a few areas where they nest pretty regularly from year to year, and to go observe them when the chicks have hatched and how they go, the parents go and bring food back and do this little chirp, and the little chicks come running is just the sweetest thing ever to observe. We do have a few questions. I always have one I like to throw out first, and that is, what kind of inspired you to kind of go in this direction and, and start researching birds more? Was there a special moment you had, or what was that you were like, this is where I want to head?
I think when I was a kid, I grew up in New Jersey, and I lived in a suburban area, and I just remember, I don't know why, but my parents were very supportive, but they weren't birders. But I just always was drawn to birds in my backyard initially. And I remember putting, bird seed in the feeder and watching all the different birds come and getting excited when I saw like my first ruby-crowned kinglet when I was a kid. And so I don't know, for some reason, I've always been drawn to birds. And then I do remember noticing that when I was really young, seeing a bird like the Baltimore Oriole. And then as I got older, not seeing them as much anymore. And so that got me thinking, wow, we really need to start thinking about protecting these birds, which really indicate how our environment is doing. And so that, set me off on the pathway to doing what I do, I guess.
Yeah, grew from there.
Yeah.
All right, and then so I'm going to start getting to our audience questions now. Is there a reason or hypothesis for the difference in plumage of East versus West Coast or oystercatchers, or is it random?
Well, they're different species, and so I don't know the evolutionarily how they diverged into two different species. They may have had one common ancestor thousands or millions of years ago, but as with any kind of adaptive radiation of a bird, of any kind of animal, when they get isolated from each other geographically, which is apparently what the American oystercatchers, which are on the East Coast, versus the Black Oystercatcher on the West Coast, when they diverge from another and they're not interacting and not sharing genes between one another, things happen, and one bird develops differently than the other one. And so for some reason, the American oystercatchers have that white plumage on their belly, and I don't know why exactly.
All right, the next one. Do other shorebirds with high populations have similar nesting habitats, such as the sanderling and murre?
There are other shorebirds that rely a lot on rocky habitats, but they do not nest on them. For example, the wandering tattler, which you can see during migration in the Oregon coast, they breed up in Alaska, and they don't breed in rocky habitat. And I'm actually don't know exactly. I think they nest in like boreal habitat, but they do not nest in rocky habitat. So I can't really think of any other shorebirds that nest on the rocky habitat in our area. Again, there's a bird called the surfbird, which winters down in California and then makes their way up again through Oregon during migration, and they utilize rocky habitat a lot for foraging, but again, do not nest on the rocky habitat. So I think, at least in this area, Black oystercatchers are your bird for nesting and foraging in the rocky habitat.
And then there was a question here about, I think they're asking what the population estimates were for 2018 and 2019.
We did not run those numbers through the model. It takes time and money to do that. We have that data, and the plan is that after we collect, we're right now not collecting any more abundance data. So we stopped collecting it, I think, in 2019. And so you're right, there's 2 years, 2018, 2019, we haven't analyzed. But the goal is that about every 5 years or so, we will do another abundance survey estimate, so that over time we can see how the population trend is doing. Because of money and time and capacity, it's a big operation to get 75 sites covered every year. So we just had to kind of say, okay, we got a good solid 5 years of data. We've analyzed the first 3 years of that. We're finding a low population, but they don't seem to be decreasing. So we're going to wait 5 years or so, and then if we have enough funding, we'll do another survey, and then over time be able to see how the population trajectory is going.
Okay. Do Black oystercatchers actually prefer the rocky habitat over stretches of sandy beaches, or is it more of that they need to adapt out of necessity because of all the rocky areas on the Oregon coast?
They will use sandy habitats sometimes, but they definitely require rocky habitat for nesting above the intertidal zone. It's just evolutionarily what they've evolved to do. Whether it's been pressured by competition with other species that utilize sandy habitats more, I'm not sure, but Black oystercatchers certainly are highly adapted to those habitats and utilize them.
It always looks so crazy out there. Those little rocky areas, they're so territorial. So they've just, the one couple on them. It's pretty amazing. Mm-hmm. Okay, can you talk to the impact of ATVs on the oystercatchers, or are the areas of concern marked? And also, does the sound from these vehicles disturb the birds? And how concerning is that?
ATVs, I think of being more about on the sandy beaches, because I mean, maybe I'm wrong. I mean, if people are riding ATVs on Rocky Habitat, that's not a good thing, and they shouldn't be doing that, because it's not only going to be impacting oyster catchers, but it's going to be impacting the marine life in the intertidal zone. But I'm thinking more ATV usages in those big sandy areas of the coast, and in that case, it's probably not a big impact on oyster catchers, since oyster catchers are sort of tied to that rocky habitat. It could impact things like the western snowy plover, which is an endangered species. We actually monitor those too. It's a separate project. And there are specific places on the coast of Oregon that are snowy plover management areas that do not allow anyone to be in at all. And they're a very small percentage of our beaches. So there's plenty of beach for people to enjoy and do the things they want to do. But there are certainly some areas that we want the birds to be protected. And so in terms of ATVs, I think the biggest impact is for those beach nesting birds like the plover, which is an endangered species and certainly needs all the help it can get.
And then just a couple more questions. Does the male bird tend to forage while the female bird watches the nest, or do they tend to form family units?
That's a good question. And I'm pretty sure that the male does more of the feeding of the young after they hatch. I'd have to check the literature on that to be sure. But I'm pretty, they divide up their duties to some degree. And obviously the females lay their eggs. I think they spend their time equally incubating. But I think once the chicks hatch, the males will actually spend a lot of the time feeding, more of the time feeding the chicks.
Oh, fascinating. And then here is one that you maybe can hypothesize on. Why do they nest on the ground?
Yeah, I mean, probably that's probably what they've done since time immemorial. And some birds nest on the ground. Even in forested habitats like juncos. I don't know if you know the dark-eyed junco, very common songbird. They nest on the ground. They just rely on that, cover concealment of vegetation on the ground to hide their nests. I live in Portland, and I live near Mount Tabor, and in the spring, I walk on Mount Tabor to go birding, and I see juncos nesting on the ground, and some of them make it. So it's just, again, it could be competition with other species. There's plenty of birds that nest in trees so they, maybe there's not enough room. Also, oyster catchers just don't have the body physique to nest in a tree. Can you imagine an oyster catcher nesting in a tree? I can't really. I mean, I've seen cormorants do it, and the cormorants often nest on rocks, and sometimes they will switch to trees. So so some birds have that flexibility in their biology to do things to switch where they nest, but for oyster catchers, I don't think they can do that.
And then one more question came in and is asking, I think it's a really great question to end with. What are some of the things citizens can do to gear up to get more marine areas and rocky habitats protected in Oregon?
Well, as I mentioned, for the Rocky Habitat process, you can just reach out to me directly, and we can get you on a community team right now. Where we have a month left to develop proposals. And so there's different community groups that I have a role coordinating. And if you are interested in sites on the North Coast, I could get you in touch with the North Coast Rocky Habitat Coalition. And there's a group of about 5 or 6 people right now developing that proposal. There's people developing the one in Audubon, Lincoln City. I can connect you with them. And there's people on the South Coast. So there's plenty of ways to get involved right now on that issue. And then if you don't want to do it right now, like I said, in next October will be the next phase. And so there's going to be a period from right now until then where the proposals that we submit at the end of the year are going to be evaluated by the Rocky Habitat Work Group, by agencies, and by the Ocean Policy Advisory Council. Some of the proposals may not make it through. They may get shot down, but they may say like, oh, well, if you resubmit and you address these points that you didn't, they might get accepted. So there might be some of that going on next fall, and leading up to fall, we'll have to develop those proposals. So there's plenty of opportunity there. For the marine reserves, Getting involved with the Cape Perpetua Collaborative that Tara leads is a great way. If you live on the coast and you're in an area near a marine reserve, get involved with one of the community groups there. If you're near Cape Perpetua, get involved with the Cape Perpetua Collaborative. If you don't live in the coast, you can still get involved through Portland Audubon or Surfrider or TNC. And there's opportunities we can engage with you. Tara, I know that was the last question. Do you want me to show that movie on the way as we end the presentation?
Yeah, let's go ahead and do that. Just for everybody too, while Joe's gearing up a little sweet short film, I have put Joe's name and email in the chat for all attendees to see, so you can copy and paste that if you want to get a hold of him. And with that, as you get the video ready, Joe, thank you again so much for joining us this morning. And thank you to everybody for coming. Joe's got a short video of oyster catchers with their chicks that we will end the, I was going to say evening with, but we're not quite there yet today, end the presentation with.
Yeah, this is a real fun video. It was taken by someone that's involved in the Otter Rock group there, trying to protect oyster catchers and involved in protecting that marine reserve. So here you go. Thank you all.